We just want to say thank you to all of the subscribers, those engaging in the comments, and for sharing our videos. It's truly exciting to see our videos resonating with so many of you, and means a lot. This all started from a love of horror movies and horror content, and clearly being inspired to move forward with our own ideas. Past the Pumpkin's Glow has some big plans for getting more listeners that will be implemented soon. Let's continue growing the Past the Pumpkin's Glow community. Before we dive into today's eerie adventure, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any of our haunting stories. Our summer hiking trip was meant to be just another check off our bucket list. Jenna and I, having been best friends and hiking enthusiasts for years, set our sights on the notorious Bear Ridge Trail. Known for its grueling paths and stunning vistas, it beckoned us with promises of adventure. We started our hike early in the morning, equipped with all essentials: water, snacks, and our sturdy hiking boots. The trail proved tougher than anticipated, featuring steep inclines and narrow ledges that skirted sheer cliffs. Nonetheless, the exhilarating challenge and the surrounding beauty fueled our spirits. Halfway through, we stumbled upon an eerie sight, an old ranger station, unexpectedly appearing amidst the dense forest. No mention of it was on our map, which piqued our curiosity and concern in equal measure. We ventured inside, driven by an adventurous spirit. The station was clearly long abandoned, with flaking paint, windows overtaken by ivy, and interiors that suggested a hasty departure. Papers strewn about, a layer of dust on a still-standing radio, and an aged map pinned haphazardly to the wall. That's when Frank appeared. Dressed in a faded ranger uniform, he initially came off as just another quirky backwoods character, claiming to check on the dilapidated station. However, as we conversed, a shift in his demeanor became apparent. He grew increasingly insistent that we shouldn't proceed with our hike, and instead spend the night at the station for safety. His pressing tone unnerved us. Exchanging worried glances, Jenna and I knew instantly that something didn't add up. We declined his unsettling offer, stating we had to return before dark. Frank's friendly facade crumbled instantly. He blocked the doorway with a stern look, escalating our fears. Thinking quickly, Jenna bluffed about having texted our family earlier, mentioning meeting Frank and expecting us to check in soon. This seemed to spook him enough to step aside. He muttered about our decision being a grave mistake as we briskly exited. With adrenaline pumping, we didn't slow down until the station was well out of sight. Each snap of a twig startled us as we hurried back to our car. Once safe, we reported our encounter to the local authorities. The sheriff's office later informed us that the ranger station hadn't been operational for over 10 years, and that recent reports of missing hikers had emerged around that area. A search of the station revealed no trace of Frank, only deepening the mystery. Jenna and I have since steered clear of Bear Ridge Trail, the incident leaving a lasting imprint on our minds. It was a stark reminder of the unpredictability of wilderness adventures and the importance of following one's instincts. Whenever we recount that day, we shudder to think of what might have awaited us had we not listened to our gut feelings. Last summer, I decided to escape the relentless pace of city life by renting a beach house on a secluded stretch of the North Carolina coast. It seemed perfect, a quiet spot away from the crowds, with uninterrupted views of the Atlantic. As a writer, I imagined it as the ideal setting to both relax and ignite my creativity. The house was every bit as picturesque as it had appeared online. A quaint cottage with a wraparound porch, surrounded by wild dunes, and large windows that offered panoramic views of the ocean. The first few days were blissful. I wrote endlessly, inspired by the tranquil surroundings, and fell asleep each night to the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore. However, my sense of peace began to erode. Initially, it was just odd feelings, like being watched. Shadows flickered at the corner of my eye, more persistent than could be dismissed as tricks of light. Unidentifiable noises at night suggested the house was settling, but felt too deliberate, too timed. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the byproduct of too many late nights spent reading horror stories. But then undeniable evidence of intrusion shattered my denial. Returning from an evening stroll on the beach, I found the back door slightly open, with muddy footprints smeared across the wooden floor of the kitchen, trailing into the living room. Nothing was missing, but the clear sign of an uninvited visitor sent a chill down my spine. I spent the next day double-checking every lock and reassuring myself that it was an isolated incident. Perhaps a local kid acting on a dare or a confused tourist. Yet, the undercurrent of unease remained, a whisper telling me something wasn't right. That whisper turned into a scream the following night. I awoke to the harsh, unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Adrenaline surged as I grabbed the bedside lamp, my only available weapon, and tiptoed downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the living room. The sight that met my eyes was straight out of a nightmare. The front window was shattered, and a dark figure was halfway through the broken pane. Instinct took over. I yelled as loudly as I could, brandishing the lamp. The intruder, evidently startled, clumsily retreated through the window and disappeared into the dark, wild dunes. Shaking, I dialed 911. The police responded quickly but found no trace of the intruder, who they speculated might be targeting isolated rental properties, preying on the solitude sought by visitors. The incident cast a shadow over the rest of my stay. The comforting isolation of the beach house now felt threatening, the ocean's calming whispers drowned out by a persistent echo of vulnerability. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and each creak and sigh of the old house made my nerves jump. I decided to cut my retreat short, driven away not by the lure of city life, but by the need for safety. As I drove away from the beach house, I looked back at the cottage through my rearview mirror. Its charm was dimmed, now backlit by the memory of fear. The peaceful solitude I had sought had been overshadowed by an acute awareness of how thin the veil between solitude and vulnerability really is. This experience left me with a poignant lesson. Even the most serene settings can conceal darker undercurrents. A place of beauty and peace can too quickly become a scene of fear and caution. It was a stark reminder that seeking isolation can sometimes invite unexpected dangers, turning what was meant to be a tranquil coastal retreat into a grave coastal warning. Our trip to the Smoky Mountains was meant to be a blissful escape. Nestled deep within the woods, the cabin we rented promised the perfect blend of adventure and tranquility, far from the noisy city life we were too accustomed to. For the first few days, it truly was paradise. The kids reveled in the freedom of the forest, and my wife and I soaked in the peace, enjoying the rare silence that enveloped our temporary home. But that silence broke one evening in a way that still causes my heart to race whenever I think about it. I remember it was a cool night, the kind of cool that hinted at the change of seasons, subtle, but definitely there. We were all winding down from the day's adventures when I heard the door handle jiggle. It was so unexpected, so out of place in our secluded retreat, that I froze for a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. Peeking through the curtains, I caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the dense cover of the trees, a shadow swallowed up by the night. That night, the cabin no longer felt cozy. It felt like a glass box, fragile and exposed. Every small sound seemed amplified, every whisper of the wind a potential threat. I spent the night double-checking locks and reassuring myself that it was just wildlife, even as my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, I called the local sheriff. His response was what I feared. "We've had similar reports," he said soberly. "Seems you folks aren't the first to have unwelcome visitors." He promised to patrol the area, but his words were small comfort. Our sanctuary had been breached, and with it, our peace of mind. Our last night there was the longest. We tried to keep things light, playing board games and laughing a bit too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny, all under the dim glow of the cabin's lamps. Then came the crash, a sound so startling that my heart skipped a beat. Glass from the kitchen window lay scattered on the floor, catching the moonlight like ice on winter mornings. As I cautiously approached, poker in hand, a figure lurked just outside the now empty window frame. It was a real, physical presence, not just a shadow this time. The air was thick with tension as I yelled out a warning about calling the cops. The figure paused, a moment stretched thin by fear, then retreated into the darkness. When the sheriff came, he found more than just our shattered window. Footprints surrounded our cabin, a silent testament to the fact that we had been watched, studied perhaps, by someone who knew we were alone. Driving away the next day, every mile put between us and the cabin felt like a small relief. The trees that had once seemed majestic now loomed ominously, their whispers more foreboding than calming. What was supposed to be a peaceful getaway had morphed into a haunting reminder of our vulnerability, a stark contrast to the safety of our urban life. We haven't returned to the Smoky Mountains since. Sometimes late at night, when the city is asleep and the world outside our window is quiet, my mind drifts back to that cabin. I wonder about the person who broke the silence of that peaceful place, and I feel a mix of anger and sadness. But mostly, I feel a deep gratitude for the safety of my family, for mornings filled with city sounds, and for nights without shadows at the window. Running has always been my escape, my way to clear my head after long days. I particularly loved my evening runs in the local park, a sprawling expanse with well-lit paths and the soothing sounds of the evening crickets. But one summer night changed all that, turning my peaceful routine into a chilling memory I can't shake off. It was a typical warm evening, and the park was buzzing with families and fellow joggers winding down. As the sun set, the crowds thinned until I was largely alone on the path. I was pushing for one last lap, earbuds in, focused on the beat of my music and the rhythm of my stride. That's when I noticed the footsteps. Initially, I assumed another runner was approaching, but a glance over my shoulder revealed no one. I shrugged it off as an echo or a trick of the wind. But then the footsteps grew louder, faster, unmistakably closing in on me. A prickling sense of dread washed over me as I realized these weren't just echoes. I pulled out one earbud and the sound became clearer, heavier. I increased my pace, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. The footsteps matched my speed, insistently present just behind me. I dared another look back. This time, I caught the briefest glimpse of a figure. Tall, dark, almost blending into the shadows. Panic set in then, pure and cold. I broke into a sprint, no longer caring about breath or pace, only about the distance I could put between myself and whatever, or whoever, was following me. The path twisted ahead, lined by thick bushes, offering no real safety or place to hide. I contemplated screaming, but the park seemed deserted, my usual comfort in solitude now a trap. The footsteps grew louder, more urgent. I was running blind, adrenaline clouding my judgment, when I spotted a light ahead. Late-night gardeners working on a nearby flower bed. Veering off the path, I headed straight for the light, the footsteps still pounding in my ears. As I approached the gardeners, I risked another glance back. The figure had stopped at the edge of the path, just at the boundary of the light, watching me. The gardeners noticed my distress and immediately came over. I managed a few breathless words about being followed, and they quickly called the park security. But by the time help arrived, the figure had vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind but my rattled nerves. I gave a statement, but there was little to go on. The security team escorted me back to my car, and I drove home with my heart still racing, the comforting routine of my runs forever marred. Since that night, I've switched to morning jogs, the night's shadows now too heavy with memories. Sometimes I pass the same path and glance warily toward where I saw the figure, half expecting to see it watching me again. But it's just a path, with joggers and walkers oblivious to my fear. A stark reminder of how quickly safety can turn to vulnerability. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night. the kind where you end up lounging at someone's house playing video games until you pass out. But when Mark suggested we sneak into the old nature park on the edge of town, curiosity got the better of us. The place was known for its walking trails that led to a muddy rock face called the Dunes. Local legends said weird things happened there, but we'd never checked it out ourselves. It was a still night, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth as our group of 5 made our way under the cover of darkness. We were halfway joking, half serious about finding something cool, maybe an abandoned campsite or some old graffiti. The path to the dunes was eerier than expected. The trees seemed to close in around us, and every little noise was amplified. We joked about what the creatures of the night were up to, trying to mask our nervousness with laughter. That was until we reached the clearing. There in the moonlit darkness of the dunes was a group of people. At first, we thought they were just some goth kids from our school, the ones who always wore black and had an affinity for creepy jewelry. But as we hid behind a thick copse of bushes, we realized there were adults among them, which was odd. They were gathered in a circle, candles flickering at their feet, illuminating symbols that looked like they were drawn in blood mixed into the dirt. It didn't seem real, more like a scene out of one of those cult classic films, rather than something you'd stumble upon in real life. Their heads were bowed, hands joined, and although we couldn't hear what they were saying, the whole setup made my skin crawl. We were about to whisper among ourselves when a twig snapped underfoot, a sound so sharp in the stillness that everyone froze. The circle broke in an instant, figures dispersing into the darkness like shadows melting away. They moved with a purpose, a practiced ease that suggested this wasn't their first secretive gathering. Silence fell over the dunes again, so dense it felt like another presence. We waited, hearts pounding, not daring to move lest one of them was still lurking nearby, waiting for us to reveal ourselves. But then, a brisk wind whipped through the clearing, snuffing out the candles in one breath. It felt like a sign, a dramatic cue in a play telling us to exit the stage. We didn't need to be told twice. Moving as quietly as we could, we retraced our steps. The normal sounds of the night had returned, but they did little to ease the tension that clung to us. We walked faster, the familiar path somehow seeming longer in our rush to leave. Once we were safely back on the main road, the floodgates opened. Everyone spoke at once, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Was it just a weird ritual? Or something more sinister? The symbols, the mix of kids and adults, it didn't add up. We never got the answers we were looking for, and none of us were brave enough to go back to the dunes. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear the faint sound of chanting carried on the breeze. A reminder of the night we stumbled upon something we were never meant to see. Our family trip to St. Augustine started as a dive into history, but ended up feeling more like a plunge into the paranormal. We'd booked an old colonial Airbnb, drawn by its antique charm and stories of historic haunts. St. Augustine, with its cobblestone streets and centuries-old buildings, was the perfect backdrop for a little adventure. From our first night in the Airbnb, the air felt heavy with more than just Florida's summer humidity. Ellie, our youngest, was the first to notice. She kept glancing towards the hallway, whispering about seeing shadows that moved. My wife and I chalked it up to an active imagination fueled by the ghost tours we'd taken during the day. The house creaked and groaned like any old structure would, but by the second night, those sounds seemed to carry weight, as if the very walls were whispering back to us. Cold spots appeared and disappeared without any reason. And objects, a book, a cup, a toy, would be found slightly moved from where we'd left them. On our third night, the unsettling incidents escalated. We were all awakened by the sound of footsteps in the attic above. Thinking perhaps an animal had gotten inside, I went to investigate. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with trunks and old furniture covered in sheets. But it was empty. No animals, no people. Yet, the air felt charged, as if something unseen was standing just out of sight. As I descended the stairs, Ellie screamed from her room. We rushed to her and found her sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fright. She stammered out that a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, had been standing at the foot of her bed. According to Ellie, he looked sad and kept looking around the room as if searching for something he'd lost. That was enough for us. We decided to spend the next day out and about, away from the house as much as possible. In town, we stopped by a small local museum where we learned about the home's original owner, a sea captain who had mysteriously vanished in the 1800s, leaving behind his family and a house filled with sorrow. Convinced now that perhaps Ellie had seen the captain, or at least the imprint of his long-ago presence, we consulted with a local paranormal expert. She wasn't surprised by our experiences. The house, she explained, was known for such occurrences, echoes of the past that sometimes bled into the present, particularly when the house decided you were worth revealing its secrets to. For our last night, we stayed in a modern hotel downtown. The contrast between the light, airy hotel room and the heavy, whispering darkness of the Airbnb was stark. We left St. Augustine with mixed feelings, enriched by the history but unnerved by its depth. Our family trip had turned into a ghost story of our own, one that we'd share for years, always wondering if what we experienced was real. Last summer, my family ditched our usual beach getaway for something different. A secluded cabin by Lake Marbury. Enticed by the serene pictures online, we were looking forward to a week away from the constant buzz of our phones and the internet. When we arrived, the cabin was charmingly rustic, hidden deep within the woods with a shaky dock poking into the lake. Its interior boasted a cozy stone fireplace and shelves laden with old books, giving it an almost timeless feel. Our first night there, as dusk melted into a star-filled sky, we began to settle down. That's when we first heard it. Soft, distant voices floating over the water. They sounded almost melodic, and we figured it must be noise from other late-night visitors across the lake. But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next couple of days, they seemed to grow louder, especially at dawn and dusk, as if rising from the mist of the lake itself. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I mentioned the eerie sounds to a local shopkeeper when we went to pick up some supplies. She was an old woman who knew every tale and story of the area. Leaning closer, her voice dropped to a whisper. Long ago, before this place was a lake, it was a bustling village. They flooded it to build a dam. Not everyone left in time, she said, her glance darting towards my kids playing outside. Her story sent a shiver down my spine, though I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a spooky local legend. However, that night, the voices were clearer than they had ever been. My youngest, Lucy, seemed really upset. They sound so sad, like they're calling for someone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Driven by a need to do something, I decided to record the voices. Standing alone on the dock with the night silent around me and the lake reflecting the moon like a mirror, I turned on my phone's recorder. The air filled with the soft chorus of voices, so vivid I almost dropped the phone. Listening back, my skin crawled. Among the unintelligible murmurs, one phrase stood out chillingly clear. Come home. We packed up and left first thing in the morning, the lake's whispers echoing in our minds. Strangely, the recording vanished from my phone, deleted without a trace, but the memory of those voices lingered. Even now, back in our noisy city life, I sometimes catch a strain of that haunting whisper in the quiet moments of the night, as if Lake Marbury's echoes are calling, ever calling through the darkness. We never went back to Lake Marbury. We couldn't. It was a place marked by beauty and mystery, but overshadowed by the ghosts of its drowned past. Every summer, Camp Redwood transforms into a little paradise for kids who come from all corners of the state, eager for adventure and the simple joy of summer camp. This year was no different, and at 16, being a camp counselor felt more like a privilege than a job. I was especially excited to be put in charge of the 7-year-olds. They were always brimming with energy, their laughter and screams filling the camp from dawn till dusk. The first few days flew by in a blur of activities. We went swimming in the lake, hiked through the nearby woods, crafted all sorts of colorful messes, and ended each day with stories around the campfire. Those evenings were my favorite part. There's something magical about sitting under the stars, the fire crackling and kids clutching their marshmallow sticks, their faces a mixture of excitement and the tiny thrill of fear from the spooky stories we shared. One night, after one such story session, I was making sure everyone was settled in for the night. As I walked past Cabin 4, a murmur of whispers caught my attention. Curious, I paused and listened. They were talking about the Shadow Man, a spectral figure said to haunt the camp every summer, allegedly spiriting away one child who would never be seen again. I chuckled softly to myself. Camp legends were always a hit, but they were just stories, or so I believed. The next morning, however, Timmy, one of the quieter boys, seemed visibly shaken. He stuck close to me throughout the day, casting nervous glances towards the dense tree line that bordered the camp. When I finally coaxed him into talking, he whispered, "The Shadow Man is real, isn't he?" I knelt beside him, putting on my most reassuring smile, and told him that it was just a campfire story, nothing more. But that night, my reassurance seemed to have done little to calm the nerves. As I did my usual rounds, I noticed Timmy's bed was empty. A spike of panic shot through me as I hurriedly searched the campgrounds, eventually finding him at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark woods. "He's coming for me," he muttered when I approached him. I felt a surge of cold despite the warm night air, but managed to convince him to return to his cabin. That unease didn't leave me that night, and I found myself restless. Then, just past midnight, the sound of footsteps outside jolted me upright. Peering out, I saw a tall, dark figure moving towards the forest. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and followed, the night air heavy with an eerie silence. Deep in the forest, the air grew unnaturally cold. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. Whirling around, the beam of my flashlight landed on a gaunt figure with hollow, piercing eyes. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was more terrifying than any campfire tale could have hinted at. Panic surged through me as its icy gaze locked onto mine. I turned and ran, heart racing, as branches whipped past my face. I thought I had escaped when suddenly the figure appeared again, right in front of me. My flashlight flickered as I stumbled backwards, the shadowy figure advancing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to close in around me. The forest felt alive, hostile, each shadow and rustle magnifying my fear. I dashed through the undergrowth, tripping over roots and dodging low-hanging branches, my breath ragged and loud in the oppressive silence. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached, but the dark figure seemed to glide effortlessly, always just a few steps behind. Just when I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, a light appeared through the trees. I pushed towards it, desperate for any sign of safety. I woke at dawn, disoriented, lying at the forest's edge. My body ached and my clothes were torn. I stumbled back to camp, where the children and staff were waiting anxiously. They rushed towards me, relief flooding their features when they saw me. They told me Timmy was found safe, asleep in his bunk. No one else had seen the figure, and my story turned into yet another camp legend. I never returned to Camp Redwood after that summer. Each year, as summer approached, I found myself thinking about the camp, about Timmy, and about the Shadow Man. I warned new counselors about him, half in jest, half in earnest, hoping no one else would encounter what I did that night. The line between legend and reality had blurred for me, and the woods at Camp Redwood now held a cautionary tale, one rooted in my own fears and the inexplicable events of that unforgettable summer. It started as a challenge. My friends and I, always in search of adrenaline, had heard about the Abandoned Carnival on the edge of town. Legends swirled around it, tales of a once lively place that shut down overnight under mysterious circumstances. Curiosity and a sense of daring drew us there one late summer evening. As we approached, the sight of the rusted gates creaking in the wind set the tone. The carnival was shrouded in overgrowth, its once bright colors faded to ghostly hues. Stepping inside felt like crossing into another realm, where the echoes of laughter and screams from decades past hung in the air. We wandered past booths with peeling paint and prizes still waiting to be won. The carousel, with its horses frozen mid-gallop, held a particularly somber watch over the grounds. It was surreal, like walking through a photograph that had lost its colors over time. Our exploration took a turn when we reached the main tent, its canvas torn and fluttering like specters in the breeze. Inside, the air was thick with dust, disturbed only by our footsteps. That's when we heard it. A faint melody, discordant and chilling as if squeezed from an old accordion's bellows. Drawn by the sound, we found ourselves standing before the Ferris wheel. It was an imposing structure, its seats swinging gently as if rocked by invisible occupants. And then, without warning, it began to turn. The squeal of rusted metal was jarring in the silence, and the sight of the wheel slowly spinning made my hairs stand on end. The music grew louder, a haunting tune that seemed to weave through the air, pulling us deeper into the carnival's heart. Shadows flickered and danced between the stalls, as if the spirits of past revelers were reenacting their joy and terror. As darkness enveloped us more fully, the atmosphere shifted from eerie to threatening. It felt as though the carnival itself was alive, aware of our presence, and not entirely welcoming. Realizing the adventure had taken a darker turn, we decided it was time to leave. Yet leaving was not as easy as entering. It was either from being disoriented or the layout seemed to have shifted, paths that were clear before now circled back on themselves. Panic set in as we struggled to find our way out. The carnival seemed reluctant to release us from its grip. Finally, after what felt like hours, we emerged from the carnival's twisted embrace. The night air outside the gates was cool and still, as if the fervor of the carnival was a contained storm, raging in its own bubble of reality. We drove home in silence, each of us processing the night's experiences in our own way. The abandoned carnival remained behind us, standing silently in the moonlight, but the memory of its haunting melody and spectral visions lingered. A chilling reminder of the night the past refused to stay buried. It was late June, and I was en route to a friend's wedding in Northern California. Cruising along Highway 101 with the windows down and the Pacific Ocean glimmering in the late afternoon sun. The drive was supposed to be a leisurely escape from my hectic work schedule, a perfect slice of solitude. Every few miles I noticed small memorials dotting the roadside, makeshift crosses, flowers, and photographs weathered by time and the sea air. Each one marked a life lost, a story ended on this beautiful but treacherous stretch of road. Stopping for gas in a sleepy coastal town, I grabbed a coffee and struck up a conversation with the station's owner. An elderly man with deep lines etched into his weathered face. He told me tales of the highway, stories of breathtaking views and sudden fogs, of reckless joyrides and tragic ends. But one story stood out, the legend of the disappearing hitchhiker. She's been seen by dozens over the years, the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Appears out of nowhere on foggy nights, thumb out, drenched, they say, as if she's walked right out of the sea. Folks stop to pick her up, and she vanishes before reaching the next town. Every single time. I laughed a bit uneasily and thanked him for the story. Back on the road, the sun dipped below the horizon, and a thick fog began to roll in from the ocean, enveloping the highway in a ghostly mist. That's when I saw her. A young woman soaked to the bone, standing by the roadside. Her eyes were hauntingly sad, her thumb outstretched. Remembering the old man's tale, I was unsure how I wanted to proceed. But curiosity overrode my fear. I slowed down, rolled down the passenger window, and called out to her. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded, her voice barely audible over the roar of the surf. "Just to the next town," she murmured, climbing into the car. We drove in silence, the only sounds the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and her shallow breaths. I glanced over, and she was staring ahead, lost in thought or memory. I wanted to ask her about herself, about where she was going, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned down the air conditioning, thinking she may be cold. As we approached the next town, I turned to speak to her, only to find the passenger seat empty. The car door had never opened. She was simply gone, leaving nothing but a damp patch on the seat and the faintest hint of salt in the air. Shaken, I pulled over and tried to make sense of what had happened. The logical part of my brain insisted it was fatigue, a trick of the light and fog. But another part, the part that had heard the sincerity in the old man's voice, knew I had encountered the hitchhiker of Highway 101. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The music turned off, the window cracked a bit to let in the slightly cool, salty air. I didn't stop again until I reached my destination, and when I shared my story, I was met with nods. "Yeah, that's her," said a local at the wedding. "She's been searching for a way home for a long time now. Seems you're one of the lucky ones, though. She must have thought you were trustworthy." I left Highway 101 with more questions than answers, the image of the hitchhiker forever etched in my mind. Was she a ghost, a collective hallucination, or something else? I suppose some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, part of the lore of this wild, mysterious coast. Thanks for tuning in to Past the Pumpkin's Glow. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you won't miss any of our chilling tales. Dare to share your own spooky experiences in the comments below. Who knows, your story might just be our next creepy highlight. Until next time, keep the lights on and the spirits at bay. Sleep tight.